The heat was a physical weight, a smothering blanket woven from dust and a merciless bone-white sky. It pressed down on the wagon, on the cracked leather of the driver's reins, and on the thin fabric of the light orange dress Aunt May wore. The color, once a defiant splash of marigold against a life of gray, was now muted by a film of alkali grit. She sat straight-backed on the rough-hewn bench, her hands folded in her lap, a posture of stillness that cost her more effort than screaming would have. The document, the cause of this journey, was tucked inside her sleeve, its sharp edges a constant reminder. It wasn't a contract. It was a bill of sale for a debt her late husband had owed, a debt she was now meant to settle. The men from town, their faces florid with cheap whiskey and casual cruelty, had called it a placement, a charitable arrangement. Their laughter had echoed in the dusty street as they'd hoisted her small trunk onto the buckboard. They were sending her to the mountain man, the one they spoke of in whispers and jeers, the cripple, the beast. A fitting end, they implied, for a foreign widow with no one to speak for her. Aunt May did not look at the two men driving the wagon. She watched the landscape change, the sparse, thirsty plains giving way to the jagged teeth of the foothills. Pine and stone replaced scrub and dirt. The air grew thinner, carrying a scent of resin and cool, dark earth that felt a world away from the baked-out town below. She had endured the crossing of an ocean in a vessel packed with sweating, fearful bodies. She had endured the loss of a husband she had barely known. She would endure this. The wagon lurched to a halt before a structure that was less a cabin and more an insult to the trees that had been felled to make it. It sagged, its timber walls gray and splintered, the roof patched with rusting tin and hope. A single grimy window stared out like a blind eye. The men guffawed, a harsh, ugly sound in the mountain quiet. One of them, a man with a stained beard, gestured with his thumb. "Home sweet home, little bird." He did not help her down. Aunt May descended with practiced grace, her worn boots making no sound on the packed dirt. She clutched her small trunk and walked toward the open doorway, a black rectangle of shadow that promised nothing. And there he was. He was a ruin seated on a throne of rough wood and iron. The chair was a crude, heavy thing, but he filled it completely, a giant trapped within its confines. His shoulders were as broad as the doorway he sat in, corded with muscle that spoke of a different life. A great tangled mane of dark hair, streaked with gray, fell past his shoulders, and a beard of equal wildness covered his chest. He was immense, a creature of the mountain itself, pinned and broken. His legs, thick as tree limbs beneath a threadbare blanket, were still, but his eyes were not. They were a pale, piercing gray, the color of a winter storm, and they fixed on her with an unnerving, absolute stillness. He was watching, assessing. The men behind her snickered again. "Enjoy your new housekeeper, Jonas," the driver called out. "She's a hard worker, we hear." The joke finally landed, sharp and brutal. They had not given her a job. They had given her to him, a piece of property to settle a ghost's debt, two broken things left on a mountain to be forgotten. Aunt May felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach, but her face remained a placid mask. She did not look back at the departing wagon. She met the mountain man's unblinking gaze. The air between them was thick with things unsaid. His pride, her fear, their shared abandonment. She took a small, deliberate breath, walked past him over the threshold, and stepped into the gloom of her new life. The silence inside was deeper than the quiet outside. It was a settled, layered thing, made of dust and disuse. The cabin was a single room, dominated by a stone hearth black with soot, and a crude cot piled with furs. The air was stale with the scent of old smoke, unwashed linen, and something else, something sharp and medicinal. Aunt May set her trunk down. The sound was a violation. Jonas did not turn his head, but she felt his eyes on her back as she surveyed the space. Every surface was coated in a layer of grime. A cast-iron pot sat by the hearth with a residue of something long since cooked crusted inside. A bucket by the door was empty. There was no order, no comfort, only the barest essentials of survival. This was not a home. It was a holding cell. She knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that this was her first test. He was waiting for her to weep, to rage, to turn and flee down the mountain path after the wagon. He was waiting for her to break. Aunt May untied the strings of her apron. She walked to the empty bucket, picked it up, and went back outside, stepping past his silent, hulking form in the doorway. She did not ask where the well or the stream was. She listened. The whisper of moving water was faint but present, somewhere down a slight decline behind the cabin. She found the path, a barely there trail through rock and pine needles, and followed it to a stream that cut through the stone, its water shockingly clear and cold. The bucket was heavy on the return trip, the handle digging into her palm, the water sloshing against her skirt. She made 3 trips before the water barrel inside the cabin was half full. She did not rest. She found a pile of rags that might have once been a shirt, tore them into usable squares, and began to clean. She started with the window, scrubbing away the layers of dirt until a weak, hazy square of light fell upon the floorboards. Then she attacked the hearth, scraping out the old ash, her arms aching with the effort. She found a small stack of wood outside, brittle and dry, and laid a new fire. All the while he watched. His silence was an immense pressure. It was not a peaceful quiet, but an active, judgmental presence. He sat like a stone sentinel, his huge hands resting on the wheels of his chair, his expression unreadable. She moved around him, a small planet orbiting a dead star. The only sounds were the scrape of iron on stone, the slosh of water, the whisper of her movements across the floor. When the sun began to dip below the peaks, casting long, cool shadows into the cabin, she turned to the matter of food. The stores were pitiful. A sack of flour crawling with weevils, a slab of salt pork, a handful of withered potatoes. She worked methodically, sifting the flour, cutting away the bad parts of the meat and vegetables. She made a simple stew, its thin aroma slowly filling the room, wrestling with the older, staler smells. When it was ready, she ladled a portion into the single clean bowl she had found and washed. She walked over to him, holding it out. His eyes lifted from the fire and met hers. They were filled with a profound, ancient weariness, and something else, a flicker of surprise. He had expected her to eat first, or perhaps not to have cooked at all. "You eat," he said. His voice was a revelation, a low, gravelly rumble that seemed to rise from the very stones of the mountain. It was the first time he had spoken to her. It was a command. Aunt May shook her head, just once. She held the bowl steady. "You first," she replied, her own voice quiet but firm. A long moment passed. The fire crackled. Outside, the world was sinking into the deep blue of twilight. He held her gaze. A silent battle of wills fought in the half-light. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, he reached out and took the bowl. His fingers, calloused and thick, brushed against hers. The touch was brief, accidental, but it sent a strange warmth through her. He ate, his movements economical and precise. She watched him, then turned away to serve herself, her heart beating a little too fast. The test was not over, but something had shifted. The days fell into a rhythm dictated by the sun and the needs of the cabin. Aunt May rose with the first gray light, her body a map of new aches. She hauled water, tended the fire, cooked, cleaned, and mended. She washed his clothes in the icy stream, her hands turning red and raw, and hung them on pine branches to dry. She learned the landscape of the small clearing, the way the light fell through the trees, the calls of the birds she did not recognize. She learned the man, too, in pieces. She learned the geography of his silence, the subtle shifts in his posture that signaled pain or weariness. She learned that he slept poorly, his breathing often catching in the night. She learned that his eyes, those stormy gray eyes, missed nothing. He watched her hands as she kneaded dough, her brow furrowed in concentration. He watched as she restitched the seam of a blanket, her fingers nimble and sure. He never offered a word of praise or thanks, but his scrutiny was a form of acknowledgment. One afternoon, a week after her arrival, she decided she could no longer abide the state of his hair and beard. They were matted and wild, hiding the man beneath. She heated water over the fire and approached him with a damp cloth and the comb from her trunk. He stiffened in his chair as she came near, a low growl rumbling in his chest. It was the sound of a cornered animal. "What are you doing?" he demanded, his voice rough with disuse. "It is not clean," she said simply, meeting his glare without flinching. "Let me." He stared at her, his jaw tight. She saw the conflict in his eyes, the fierce pride warring with years of neglect, and the simple human need for another's touch. She didn't wait for permission. She reached out and gently began to work the cloth through the tangled ends of his beard. He did not move. He sat rigid, his massive body radiating tension as she carefully, patiently began to clean. Her touch was light, impersonal at first, the way one would handle a difficult task. But as she worked, the tension in him slowly began to ebb. She washed his hair next, pouring basin after basin of warm water over his head, her fingers working through the knots. It was a long, arduous process. When she was done, she combed it out, the dark, heavy strands falling smooth and clean against the back of his chair. She took a pair of scissors from her sewing kit, and with his unspoken consent, trimmed the wildness from his beard, shaping it until the strong, sharp line of his jaw was visible for the first time. Throughout it all, he remained utterly still, his eyes closed. When she finally stepped back, he opened them. The weariness was still there, but it was joined by something new, something vulnerable. The man who looked at her now was not the beast from the town's cruel jokes. He was just a man. A handsome man, she realized with a jolt, his features strong and well-formed beneath the wilderness. He lifted a hand and touched his trimmed beard, his expression one of distant wonder. "Why?" he asked, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. Aunt May gathered the soiled cloths, her gaze focused on her task. "There is no beauty in dirt," she said, her back to him. It was the closest she could come to explaining the impulse that had driven her, the need to restore order, to find the person buried beneath the neglect, to care for him not as a burden, but as a man. The silence that followed was different. It was lighter, less heavy with judgment, and more with a quiet, shared understanding. The barrier between them, once a wall of stone, had become a thin sheet of glass. They could see each other clearly now. The silence became companionable. They would sit in the evenings, the fire painting flickering shadows on the walls, and a quiet comfort would settle between them. He would watch her sew. She would be aware of his gaze, no longer feeling it as a weight, but as a steady presence. He began to speak more, not in conversations, but in single, weighted words. Water. More wood. Cold. Each was an order, but also an admission of need, a crack in the fortress of his pride. She answered not with words, but with action, her quiet efficiency a language he understood. One afternoon, while sweeping beneath his cot, her broom knocked against something solid. She knelt and pulled out a small, leather-wrapped object. It was a book. Its cover was worn smooth with handling, but it was made of fine, supple leather, and a small, intricate design was pressed into its corner in what looked like faded gold leaf. It was an object of quality, utterly out of place in the squalor of the cabin. She held it, running her thumb over the smooth cover. It felt like a secret. She looked up at him. He was watching her, his face unreadable. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. Permission. She opened it. The pages were filled not with printed words, but with elegant handwritten script, accompanied by stunningly detailed drawings of plants and flowers, each labeled in a language she didn't recognize, but the script itself was a work of art. It was a botanist's journal, a scholar's work. This was the telling detail, the pristine object hidden among the poverty. This man, this broken giant, was more than he seemed. She closed the book gently and slid it back into its hiding place, but the knowledge of it remained with her. It changed the way she saw him. The silence was no longer just an absence of noise. It was the quiet of a man who held a world of thoughts inside him. A few nights later, a storm rolled in, a violent, crashing thing that shook the small cabin. Rain lashed against the window and thunder cracked like the sky splitting apart. A log in the fireplace shifted, sending a cascade of embers onto the floorboards. Before Aunt May could move, a spark ignited a small pile of kindling she'd left too close to the hearth. A tiny flame licked upward, hungry. Jonas moved with a speed that defied his condition. He spun his chair, grabbing a heavy fur blanket from his cot, and, with a powerful heave of his upper body, threw it over the fledgling fire, smothering it instantly. He was left panting, his face pale in the firelight. Aunt May rushed to his side. "Are you all right?" she asked, her hand hovering near his shoulder. He nodded, his breathing ragged. "Careless," he rasped, the word a condemnation of himself for not noticing the hazard. "It was my fault," she said softly. "I left it there." Their eyes met. In that moment, surrounded by the storm's fury, they were not a warden in his charge. They were two people in a small, fragile shelter, protecting each other. The air was charged with something more than the storm. He reached up, his large hand surprisingly gentle, and cupped her jaw. His thumb stroked her cheek. His gaze was intense, searching. "Aunt May," he said, her name a prayer on his lips. "Closer." She leaned in, her heart hammering against her ribs. He guided her face to his, and his lips met hers. The kiss was not demanding or passionate. It was tentative, questioning, a taste of wood smoke and loneliness and a desperate, unspoken need. It was a confirmation of the bond that had grown between them in the quiet, watchful days. When they broke apart, the storm outside seemed to have quieted, its rage spent. He did not release her, his hand still cradling her face. A single tear escaped her eye and traced a path through the grime on her cheek. She did not know why she was crying. He wiped it away with his thumb. "Don't," he whispered. It was a plea. The arrival of Mr. Crawford was an intrusion of a world they had both forgotten. He rode up to the cabin one bright, hot morning, his horse a fine, glossy chestnut, his clothes tailored and clean. He was a man who reeked of authority and ownership, his face set in a permanent sneer of condescension. He was one of the men from the town, the one who had orchestrated the charitable arrangement. He dismounted and strode toward the cabin as if he owned the very ground it stood on, his polished boots a stark contrast to the dusty earth. Aunt May was outside, splitting kindling with a small hatchet, the rhythmic work a comfort. She saw him coming and straightened, her hand tightening on the handle. Jonas was just inside the doorway, watching, his face a grim, stony mask. Crawford stopped a few feet from her, his eyes sweeping over her with open disdain. He noted her clean apron, the tidy stack of wood, the smoke curling peacefully from the chimney. "Well, I'll be," he said, a cruel smile twisting his lips. "Tamed the wilderness, have you? Even made the beast presentable." He gestured with his chin toward Jonas. "I've come on business, Jonas. A formality, really." Jonas said nothing. He simply watched, his stillness more intimidating than any threat. Crawford pulled a sheaf of papers from his coat pocket. "As you know, your claim on this plot is tenuous, unworked, unimproved. The territorial government is keen to see this land put to productive use. I have filed a petition. Given your condition, they are inclined to agree. I'm prepared to offer you $100 for your signature, a gesture of goodwill." He held out the papers and a pen. It was not an offer. It was an eviction notice disguised as charity. The $100 was an insult, enough to put Jonas in some squalid room in town to be forgotten forever. "The mountain is not for sale," Jonas said, his voice flat and cold as river stone. Crawford laughed, a short barking sound. "The mountain? You don't own the mountain, you broken down fool. You own this patch of dirt, and soon you won't even own that. Now sign the paper. Don't make this difficult." "This land is mine," Jonas stated, his voice low and dangerous. "By what right?" Crawford sneered. "A piece of paper filed by your father 30 years ago? That won't stand up. The law is on the side of progress, and I am progress." Aunt May stepped forward, placing herself slightly between Crawford and the doorway. "You should leave," she said, her voice quiet but unwavering. Crawford's eyes snapped to her. His smile vanished. You have no say in this. You are property, same as the chair he sits in. A piece of chattel used to settle a debt. Now get out of the way." He took a step toward the cabin, his intention clear. He would force the pen into Jonas's hand if he had to. Jonas's hands tightened on the wheels of his chair, his knuckles white. For the first time, Aunt May saw not just weariness in his eyes, but a white-hot, helpless fury. The fury of a king trapped in a broken body, unable to defend his own threshold. Aunt May did not move. She stood her ground, a small, unmovable obstacle in a simple orange dress. "I said," she repeated, her voice dropping lower, colder, "leave." Crawford's face purpled with rage. He raised a hand, ready to shove her aside. "You insolent—" "I wouldn't," a new voice cut in. It came from the trees. 2 men stepped out from the shade of the pines. They were not dressed like townsfolk. They wore practical, durable clothing and carried themselves with a quiet competence that was far more menacing than Crawford's bluster. Each man held a rifle, not aimed, but held at a ready that suggested they could be aimed in a fraction of a second. Crawford froze, his hand dropping to his side. He stared at the men, his mind struggling to process their appearance. "Who in the hell are you?" he demanded, his voice losing some of its confident bluster. "We work for Mr. Hale," the taller of the 2 men said calmly. His eyes flickered toward Jonas. Crawford's face contorted in confusion. "Hale? There's no Hale here. This is Jonas. Just Jonas." Jonas wheeled his chair forward slightly, emerging from the shadow of the doorway into the full sun. The light caught in his clean hair, illuminating the sharp intelligence in his eyes. The weariness was gone. replaced by an iron certainty. "My name," he said, his voice resonating with an authority that stunned Crawford to silence, "is Jonas Hale." The name hung in the air. Crawford's mouth worked, but no sound came out. The Hale family. They were a myth in the territory, a name whispered in connection with the railroad, with mining syndicates, with vast unseen fortunes. They were said to own half the state, but no one had ever seen them. They were ghosts of wealth and power. That's impossible," Crawford stammered. "You're a hermit, a cripple." "I am," Jonas agreed, his tone dangerously mild. "And you, Mr. Crawford, are a trespasser. You are standing on my property. In fact, the town you rode from, the bank you own, the very street you live on, it is all built on land leased from my family. A lease which, I assure you, contains clauses regarding the conduct of its tenants." He held Crawford's terrified gaze. "You see, my father believed that wealth corrupted a man's judgment. He preferred to observe people when they thought he had nothing. I have found it a useful philosophy." He gestured with his head toward Aunt May. "Some people, when faced with what they believe to be weakness, reveal their cruelty. Others," his voice softened almost imperceptibly, "reveal their character." The full, crushing weight of the revelation landed on Crawford. He was not threatening a helpless cripple. He was threatening his landlord, a landlord with the power to ruin him utterly with a single signature. The papers fell from his nerveless fingers and scattered in the dust. Aunt May stared at Jonas, her mind reeling. The worn cabin, the meager food, the isolation, it was all a choice, a disguise, a test, a fortress built not of logs and stone, but of deception. She looked from the expensive book to the finely balanced knife she'd seen him cleaning, to the quiet competence of the men now flanking his chair. It all clicked into place. She had been sent here as a cruel joke, but she had stumbled into the hidden court of a king. Crawford stumbled backward, his face the color of ash. I didn't know." "You knew he was a man in need," Jonas said, his voice cutting like a shard of ice, "and you tried to profit from it. Get off my mountain, Mr. Crawford. Do not come back. A notice regarding the termination of your business leases will arrive by the end of the week." Crawford scrambled for his horse, hauling himself into the saddle with clumsy, panicked movements. He galloped away without a backward glance, a man fleeing his own ruin. The dust settled. The quiet returned. The two armed men melted back into the trees as silently as they had appeared. Aunt May and Jonas were alone again. The silence that descended was different from any that had come before. It was vast, echoing with the enormity of what had just been revealed. Aunt May looked at the cabin, the worn bucket, the patched roof. They were no longer symbols of poverty, but props in an elaborate play. She looked at Jonas, the man she had washed and fed and cared for, and saw a stranger. A powerful, wealthy man who had allowed her to believe he was destitute. A knot of confusion and a sharp sting of betrayal tightened in her chest. She had offered him her compassion, her labor, her trust, all under false pretenses. Was her own quiet endurance just another part of his test? Had he been laughing at her naivete all along? She turned away from him, her back rigid, and began to gather the scattered kindling, her movements jerky and sharp. She needed the familiar weight of a task in her hands, something real to hold on to in a world that had just dissolved into smoke and mirrors. "Aunt May." His voice was quiet, stripped of the iron authority he had used on Crawford. It was just Jonas again. She did not turn around. "You lied to me," she said, her voice small and tight. Not with words, but with everything else, with the dirt and the silence and the carefully constructed helplessness. "I did not lie," he said. "I withheld. There is a difference." "Is there?" she shot back, finally turning to face him. The hurt was plain on her face now, her mask of composure finally cracking. "You let me believe you were abandoned, alone. You let me work my fingers raw for a life that was a fiction." "It was not a fiction," he insisted, his gray eyes pleading with her to understand. "The pain is real. The paralysis is real. The loneliness," his voice dropped to a near whisper, "was very real. The money changes none of that. It only makes it worse. It builds a wall higher than any mountain. People see the fortune, not the man. They offer pity, or they circle like vultures. They never offer simple, honest kindness." He wheeled his chair closer to her, his large hands resting on the worn wood of the wheels. "My father built this cabin as a retreat, a place to remember what was real. After my accident, I came here to die. But I found I was too stubborn, so I stayed. I watched the world from a distance, and I waited. I didn't know what I was waiting for. I suppose I was waiting for someone who would see the man, not the ruin. Someone who would not run away or try to use me." His gaze was locked on hers, raw and vulnerable. "Then they brought you. A joke, they said. And I watched you. You never complained. You never wept. You faced every hardship with a quiet grace that shamed this entire mountain. You cleaned my home. You washed my hair. You looked at me and you saw a man worth caring for, even when you thought I had nothing. Do you have any idea what a gift that is?" The anger in Aunt May began to recede, replaced by a slow, dawning comprehension. He hadn't been testing her for worthiness to share his fortune. He had been testing her to see if she was real, if her compassion was authentic. The endurance test wasn't for her. It was for him. A test to see if he could trust another human being again. She walked slowly toward him and knelt in the dust before his chair. She looked into his eyes and saw the truth of his words reflected there, the profound, soul-deep isolation that no amount of money could cure. She saw the man she had come to know in the quiet days, the man who listened to the sound of her breathing in the dark, the man whose silent presence had become the anchor of her world. The wealth, the power, the hidden kingdom, it was all secondary. It was scenery. The real story was here, in the small space between them. She reached out and placed her hand on his, her small, calloused fingers covering his large, powerful ones. "I saw a man," she said softly. "That is all." A deep, shuddering breath escaped him, the sound of a weight he had carried for years finally being set down. He brought her hand to his lips and pressed a kiss to her knuckles. It was a gesture of fealty, of gratitude, of profound relief. The tension of the confrontation and the revelation drained away, leaving behind a stillness that was peaceful and pure. The sun was beginning its descent, painting the western sky in hues of orange and rose, colors that echoed the worn fabric of her dress. He kept her hand in his grip firm and warm. "I have something to show you," he said. He guided her as she pushed his chair away from the cabin, toward a rise she had never explored. The path was smoother here, wider, as if maintained. They crested the small hill, and the view that opened up before them stole her breath. Below them, a vast valley unfurled, a tapestry of deep green meadows and shimmering blue streams, cradled by the protective arms of the surrounding peaks. A large, beautiful house, built of golden stone and dark timber, sat nestled by a lake, its windows catching the last rays of the dying sun. It was a world away from the crude cabin on the mountainside. It was a paradise hidden in plain sight. "My home," he said quietly. "The real one." Aunt May stared at the magnificent vista, but her gaze kept returning to him. The house, the valley, the wealth, it was all his. But he had chosen the simple cabin. He had chosen to wait. "Why show me now?" she asked. "Because the test is over," he answered, turning his chair to face her fully. "For both of us. That cabin is my past, a place of waiting. This," he swept his hand out to encompass the valley, "can be our future. If you will have it. If you will have me." He was not offering her his fortune. He was offering her his life. He was asking her to share the beautiful, lonely kingdom he had hidden from the world. Aunt May looked from the valley back to his face, illuminated in the warm twilight. She saw no trace of the beast, no shadow of the ruin. She saw Jonas, her Jonas, strong, proud, and finally, truly seen. She smiled, a small, genuine smile that reached her eyes for the first time since she'd arrived on this mountain. "You have a great deal of mending to do in that big house, I imagine," she said, her tone light. "It will require a good housekeeper." His answering smile was like the sun breaking through clouds. He lifted her hand again, his thumb stroking the back of it. "I was hoping for a queen." He leaned forward and she met him halfway. Their kiss this time was not one of tentative discovery or desperate need. It was a kiss of homecoming, a quiet promise made in the vast, silent cathedral of their own private world. The mountain stood witness, its peaks glowing in the alpenglow, as the widow and the king began their reign.